Does your company have a product or service that data professionals would benefit from? A BI tool, a cloud solution, or the kind of thing that a data skeptic listener would be interested to learn about? Reach out to advertising@dataskeptic.com. Maybe we can help you bring your message to the audience you're looking for. Have you ever been frustrated by the accuracy of data as portrayed in the media? Sure, we all have. A picture may be worth 1,000 words, but if 900 of them are me complaining about the scale and the axis and the absence of error bars, then what good is the visual? But despite the availability of sophisticated techniques, I doubt if most people have or are going to read the grammar of graphics. Most won't watch an Edward Tufte lecture, and few people, I guess, ultimately are really going to care about the things that get hotly debated, and for good reason, in the data visualization community. Conveying a point estimate, pretty easy. Conveying uncertainty, you have lots of options and not necessarily an obviously correct one. I guess this problem's a little harder than I thought. Welcome to Data Skeptic Interpretability. Today on the show, I'm joined by Jessica Hullman, Assistant Professor of Computer Science and Engineering at Northwestern University and author of the paper, Why Authors Don't Visualize Uncertainty. I picked up a number of great insights from this paper, and I'm looking forward to this conversation right after the break. Hey Data Skeptic listeners, we're launching another survey and we'd like your help. If you've got 2 minutes to spare, please take our survey at dataskeptic.com/survey. Your feedback helps us deliver the quality content you can find from Data Skeptic, and you might just win a free t-shirt. So do me a favor and head over to dataskeptic.com/survey and tell us about yourself.
I'm an assistant professor at Northwestern, primary appointment in computer science, but I also have a partial appointment in journalism. I do research and advise students on data visualization. I run a lab where we focus on data visualization and uncertainty communication called the MU Collective, or the Midwest Uncertainty Collective.
Tell me a little bit more about the collective. What sorts of projects get taken on?
So this is me and a colleague of mine, Matthew Kay, that co-direct it. I would say based on kind of shared interests that we discovered maybe 4 or 5 years ago when we started working together, we've really devoted a lot of time to thinking about kind of how do we redesign visualizations to help people reason better with uncertainty. And so a lot of our projects are concerned with things like how do we design ways for people to interact with data that better account for uncertainty from sampling error or other sources? How do we model reasoning under uncertainty as people are using visualization systems to make inferences? And we do some other work as well. We both kind of are sort of straight data visualization people as well to some extent. So I do a lot of work on like automated visualization as well for different kind of settings, like how do we make tools that help authors design things like dashboards. But a lot of our work, I'd say, is in some way focused on making better visualization tools for reasoning about data under uncertainty.
I meant to hear you have an appointment that's both covering computer science and journalism catches my attention. What lies at the intersection of those two fields?
So I think a lot of my work in visualization, since I was in a PhD program, has kind of focused on how people sort of naturally or spontaneously draw inferences from graphs. And I would say in contrast to some of sort of the original work in the field of information visualization, which is like the field around sort of like computer generated visualizations of data, my work has focused a little bit more on kind of creating visualizations for settings like the media, where you have a large group of people all trying to interpret data. You're often trying to communicate data more so than to only support inference or analysis, which has kind of been more traditionally the topic of visualization research. And so I would say my interest in journalism came out of this desire to sort of focus on these aspects of visualization design and how we build systems that can better support these kind of communication contexts. And the media, I think, is a great example because people are looking to, data-driven reports, interactives created by different news outlets in order to figure out kind of like, what should I believe about the world around me? Like, what's going to happen in the next election? What's going on with the climate? What's going on with the latest health pandemic. And so I think journalists have a ton of power in terms of how they present data to help people kind of make these everyday decisions about, how they should prepare for different things or whether they should get out and vote. And so I think it's important that some researchers are focusing kind of on how do we convey uncertainty in ways that someone can understand without, say, an advanced stats background. How do we help authors who maybe don't have the sort of advanced training in data science to still create visualizations that are useful useful. So I think there's a lot of important research problems at that space. And so that's kind of drawn me to this intersection. But it's definitely, I mean, it's a very weird intersection. It's just in that computer science, which is more what I'm trained in, is very different from journalism. So I'm always kind of navigating, how to speak to both audiences.
Well, I'm going to ask what I hope doesn't sound like an accusatory question, but why should we assume that the public at large that media is going to target has enough, numeric literacy to understand representations of uncertainty?
Well, I would say because we reason about uncertainty constantly in daily life. And, just because maybe when you put a graph in front of people, it's a little harder for certain people who haven't been exposed to graphs a lot, does not mean that we don't have very sophisticated cognitive and perceptual systems that are capable of seeing signal in noise, etc. So I would argue that even when it comes to uncertainty or probability, we have a natural way in which we reason about these things. So if I asked you, what are the chances that if you get to the bus stop every day at the same time, you're going to catch the bus? You can think about that. You could probably harbor a guess. And that's because we're able to sort of do things like infer probabilities from things like frequencies in the real world. And so I think people do have ways of making inferences that are pretty reliable. A lot of times we use heuristics, which are kind of mental shortcuts. But in a lot of cases, the reason we've sort of evolved to use mental shortcuts to kind of make quick decisions from data is because they work well. And so even if the average person can't even tell you why they're making a certain judgment the way they are, that doesn't mean that they're not capable of doing some pretty sophisticated things. So I guess my mindset has always been kind of yes, people can be biased in some cases, or people who aren't trained might have trouble understanding certain things, but I in no way think there's innate deficiencies. I think we just don't know how to frame information in ways that kind of naturally make use of people's sort of internal representations or spontaneous ways of making sense of data. And so just to give one example relevant to the example I just gave, often we'll show uncertainty in data. By uncertainty, I mean things like sampling error. Our typical default methods will be things like error bars, where we're showing kind of an interval, which might be a confidence interval or might be a standard error range, and we'll show it as kind of a graphical annotation. That is a type of visualization that a lot of audiences, definitely untrained audiences or audiences that lack statistical background, have trouble with. Even people who have statistical backgrounds struggle with these types of representations. But one of the things we found in my lab is that if we simply switch to sort of a frequency framing or a discrete framing of probability, this can help people a lot. So rather than showing you an interval, like an error bar on a bar chart, I might switch to showing you actual sort of draws from the distribution I'm trying to convey to you. So we could show you an animation where we're actually taking samples from the underlying distribution we want to convey, or we could show something static where we're showing a bunch of kind of dots. So where you would have a bar with an error bar, you're seeing sort of a depiction of the distribution, but made out of dots. So hypothetical kind of samples. And people can then reason about 2 out of 10 times this might happen, or 1 out of 5 times I might see this outcome. This is one of the ways in which you take into account how people naturally reason about complex phenomena, in this case, probability. We look at the fact that, people tend to do better with frequency framings. We can then incorporate that into how we design representations of data. And so what we find is that people do a lot better if we design the uncertainty visualization in such a way that accounts for what we're naturally good at or the ways that we naturally think.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a range of sophistication in literature, everything from what might, I guess, be on the grocery store checkout lines to academic journals, and I would hope we'd see more error bars in the latter. Where do you start to see the uncertainty visualizations beginning in that path from sort of casual to formal literature? We'll see it in some newspapers, we'll see it in some blogs. Where does it catch on, I guess, where people who produce publications?
Unfortunately, I think it really has only caught on kind of as a norm in the scientific literature, and that's because I think it's expected there. So you can think about science, or empirical science at least, as largely kind of a discussion of uncertainty. And so we've developed as scientists the ability to recognize that when we present any sort of estimates, we need to put some error bounds on that, or we somehow need to convey what we don't know. So I think in the sciences, it is kind of expected that you'll convey uncertainty. If you have a bar chart, showing means, people want to see some sort of representation of error, usually on an error bar. That doesn't mean they're working well in that setting, but that is at least where it's conventional. I think, unfortunately, once you move outside of a scientific domain, I think so I've looked at journalists and people making sort of data-driven reports in government. I would say the norm tends to be to omit any sort of explicit representation of error or uncertainty, with the exception of when we're plotting raw data. So sometimes people will just show you you some data they've collected and just show you all the data points. And so on some level, you're seeing distribution there. I think the problem is that so often in these government reports, in the media, we are presenting data for inference. So, sometimes we're presenting historical data, but we're presenting it in a way that people want to use it to make predictions about what's going to happen in the future, or we're presenting some sort of model results. And there, I think there's this tendency to think that, uncertainty is just going to kind of overwhelm my user. And that to me is very dangerous. So I think once you move outside of science, we tend to forget that people are still making inferences under uncertainty. And I think there's a tendency to believe that if we convey error or uncertainty kind of faithfully, we will confuse the reader so much that it'll be worse than if we don't convey it. So I think a really interesting paper by someone, also a professor at Northwestern, but in economics, Charles Mansky, where he calls this phenomena the lure of incredible certitude, where we tend to want to present estimates as though they're basically certain. And so I have talked to a lot in a paper I did called Why Authors Don't Visualize Uncertainty. I talked to a bunch of journalists and data visualization designers, so people who are kind of well respected in the sort of online community following visualization, to ask kind of how do they see this question of like, should I convey uncertainty if I'm presenting estimates? And it was really interesting. I think there's a lot of, on the one hand, responsibility or feeling of responsibility and recognition that people are making decisions from the data we show. They're making all these kind of everyday decisions about what to do. And so we should be conveying error or uncertainty. But at the same time, I heard a lot of different viewpoints about it's going to confuse people, or I work with an editor, those people who were journalists, where it's all about kind of maintaining the attention of the reader, and we can't put anything that might potentially distract them or overwhelm them. There were also a lot of reasons why I think journalists and other authors are not conveying uncertainty related to just kind of the fact that it's difficult to calculate a good error estimate. A lot of people, even who are creating data visualizations, are perhaps not comfortable with statistical concepts. We're used to dealing with data as though it's kind of all just historical information and we just want to know what happened in our data set. But when it comes to training on how to think about any sort of case where we're using data to make predictions about the future or draw inferences outside of the sample of data that we actually have, I think that's where a lot of people just feel kind of insecure. Stats is hard. It's a lot of the important kind of concepts in stats are not intuitive. And I think people are very aware of that. And so I heard a lot of reasons related to sort of lack of certainty in one's ability to communicate it well. So I think there's other reasons related to that. We don't have good visualizations. That's part of what my lab has been working on. But I think there's by and large this feeling that like we only have these sort of crufty statistical graphics like error bars and box plots, and we can't use those because they don't feel appropriate for broader audiences. So there's a big sort of bucket of all these different reasons, I think, that are contributing to why we don't see uncertainty communicated much. That said, there are certain graphics departments at some of the big newspapers. There are certain government agencies that are really trying hard to change this and really innovating. So the Upshot, New York Times graphics department has been doing really interesting stuff for a while with things like simulation to show people they have some model predicting election outcomes, etc. Like what are possible outcomes we could get from this model, or what are possible outcomes that are congruent with what the model is saying, etc. A lot of interactives where people can kind of experiment and make their own predictions and compare to what the data says. So these are all, I think, interesting ways in which people are trying to innovate. It unfortunately is still kind of a minority of authors doing that kind of work.
So I can imagine where there's a big soup of ideas, many of which you covered, as to why someone might not include uncertainty. Are there any that dominated the response of the professionals you interviewed, or were there just a lot of variety in the answers?
So I think the primary one I would say is just this idea that it's not going to help me communicate what I want to communicate. So even the people who are not in journalism still kind of talked about how you're trying to keep butts in the seats, as one person said. So you're constantly editing. And I think for visualizations intended to communicate, the authors are often aware of what messages they are trying to convey. So there's a few patterns or a few different types of tasks they want to support. And I think there was a very strong perception across the board, even when they spoke about wanting to convey uncertainty, that it would get in the way of communicating this pattern or this message that I'm explicitly trying to get across. And it was so pervasive that it basically led me to then start asking myself as I was interviewing people and thinking about the data, is that maybe the more pragmatic thing to do? Are they sort of correct, perhaps, that uncertainty could only sort of obfuscate this message or this signal that they're trying to get across? I ended up sort of thinking very deeply about this. It was kind of a fun project, and really starting to think about, well, what happens when someone is looking at a visualization and you're trying to use your visualization to convey some message to them? Like, how do they judge whether that message is true or not? Because what a lot of the authors seem to say or refer to was like, they went kind of through this exploratory data process themselves, where they had a bunch of data, they looked at it in all different ways, they figured out what are the patterns. Those patterns become like the messages or the patterns they want to convey to others. And I think what they're not potentially thinking about is, how does the end user, the viewer, the reader for a journalism outlet, et cetera, how are they going to decide if that message is actually there? Because that's where uncertainty is critical. If I'm showing you averages, et cetera, and the point is that I want to show that there's a big difference between this candidate and this candidate's chance of winning, et cetera, how does the reader really judge that without any notion of the error in those estimates? I think one thing that I sort of surmised is that while the best visualization designers are thinking about this kind of thing, it's still, we don't always, when we design visualizations for these broad settings, really specify like, what is the task I want someone to do, and exactly how are they going to do that task, and how are different aspects of my visualization design going to help them or hinder them in doing that task. So anyway, I ended up sort of really getting deep into like, what do people do when they have a visualization and they're trying to judge, is there a pattern here? And that visualization doesn't show uncertainty versus shows uncertainty. And there's actually some really interesting work done by some statisticians, people like Andrew Gauman, Andreas Buja, Diane Cook, that proposes models for what we do naturally when we look at a graph to judge if there's a pattern. So there's this area of kind of stats called graphical statistical inference. And what they argue is that often when you look at a graph, you have sort of an implicit imagined reference distribution. So you're kind of looking at the data and you're trying to compare that to some mental model you have of like, what's reasonable for that data set? And is this like a deviation from some expected pattern that I'm looking for? So maybe if you're looking at a histogram, you're kind of implicitly thinking about, is it a normal distribution or not? Because often that's how we use histograms. And so in the same sort of project where I ended up at was really starting to think about like precisely what happens when a viewer looks at a visualization and they're trying to judge, do I believe this is a pattern? And how does conveying uncertainty actually help the author